August 20th, 1940. Coyoacán, a quiet, sun-baked suburb of Mexico City. The air inside the heavily fortified villa was thick and still. Leon Trotsky, the exiled co-founder of the Soviet Union, sat at his cluttered wooden desk. He was feeding his rabbits earlier that morning. Now he was reading a manuscript. Standing right behind him was a man he knew as Frank Jackson. Jackson was the boyfriend of a trusted secretary. He was polite, wealthy, and supposedly uninterested in politics. But today, despite the sweltering Mexican heat, Jackson was wearing a heavy raincoat. Trotsky leaned forward, his eyes scanning the typewritten pages. He didn't see Jackson reach inside the lining of the coat. He didn't see the hand grip the sawed-off wooden handle of a mountaineer's ice axe. Jackson closed his eyes, raised the heavy steel blade high into the air, and brought it down with the full, violent force of his body into the back of Trotsky's skull. The assassin expected a quiet kill. He expected the old man to slump forward, dead on the desk. Instead, Trotsky let out a sound that defied human description. It was a prolonged, blood-curdling scream. Jackson froze in absolute terror. The scream was so loud, so filled with a sudden, primal realization, that the assassin later confessed it echoed in his nightmares for the rest of his life. Trotsky didn't die. With his skull shattered and his brain hemorrhaging, the 60-year-old revolutionary stood up. He turned around. Blood poured down his face, blinding him, but he threw himself at his attacker. He grabbed Jackson's hand, biting down on his flesh with desperate fury. The guards outside heard the scream. They burst through the doors, their weapons drawn, and threw the assassin to the floor, beating him with the butts of their revolvers. Trotsky leaned against the doorframe, his life bleeding out onto the floorboards. He looked at the man on the ground. He didn't see Frank Jackson. He saw the shadow of the Kremlin. "Don't kill him," Trotsky gasped to his guards. "He must talk. He has a story to tell." Trotsky knew exactly who had sent the man with the axe. He had spent 11 years running, hiding, and waiting for this exact moment. 7,000 miles of ocean, high concrete walls, and armed guards were not enough. Joseph Stalin's paranoia had finally caught up to him. The gray blur and the firebrand. To understand the visceral, obsessive hatred that fueled this global hunt, you have to go back to the ashes of the Russian Empire in 1917. Leon Trotsky was the superstar of the Bolshevik Revolution. He was a brilliant intellectual, a mesmerizing orator, and a ruthless military genius. When the newly born Soviet state was invaded from all sides during the Russian Civil War, Trotsky built the Red Army from scratch. He rode an armored train across the front lines, directing millions of men, inspiring them to victory through sheer force of will. Beside him, Joseph Stalin was practically invisible. Stalin was not a great speaker. He was not a military genius. Fellow revolutionaries dismissed him as an uneducated thug from Georgia. Trotsky openly mocked him, famously calling Stalin the most outstanding mediocrity in our party. To the brilliant intellectual, Stalin was just a gray blur, a low-level clerk who handled the boring paperwork. But Trotsky fundamentally misunderstood the mechanics of modern power. While Trotsky was writing books and giving speeches, Stalin was quietly mastering the bureaucracy. When Vladimir Lenin's health collapsed in 1922, Stalin was appointed general secretary. He used that dull administrative title to systematically pack the Communist Party with his own loyalists. "Theory does not hold power," Stalin whispered to his allies in the dark corridors of the Kremlin. "Appointments hold power." When Lenin died in 1924, a massive vacuum opened. Trotsky expected to be crowned the successor by popular acclaim. Instead, he walked into a political ambush. When it came time to vote on the direction of the country, Trotsky looked around the room and realized with a sudden sinking dread that he didn't recognize anyone. Stalin hadn't fought him with speeches. He had defeated him with paperwork. By 1927, the trap snapped shut. Stalin stripped Trotsky of his military rank. He expelled him from the Communist Party, and in 1929, he forced him onto a train, exiling him from the very empire he had helped create. The nightmare of the alternative Stalin had won. He sat alone at the top of the Soviet pyramid. But absolute power breeds absolute paranoia. For Stalin, exiling Trotsky wasn't a victory. It was a mistake. As long as Trotsky drew breath, he was a living, breathing alternative to Stalinism. He was the true Bolshevik, the man who could claim the mantle of Lenin. Every time a factory failed to meet its quota, every time a harvest collapsed and millions starved in Ukraine, Stalin looked over his shoulder. He didn't see starving peasants. He saw Trotsky's ghost, waiting to return and lead a coup. "He is a man who cannot sleep as long as a witness remains," Trotsky wrote from exile. Trotsky didn't go quietly into the night. He weaponized his pen. From Turkey to France to Norway, Trotsky published the Bulletin of the Opposition. He smuggled his writings back into Russia. He exposed Stalin's lies. He called him a gravedigger of the revolution. He founded the Fourth International, calling on workers worldwide to rise up against the Soviet bureaucracy. Stalin read every word. The dictator would sit in his Kremlin office, circling Trotsky's printed words with a red pencil, his rage boiling. He realized that a man with a printing press in Paris was more dangerous than a man with a tank division in Moscow. The order was given to the NKVD, the Soviet secret police. The objective was no longer surveillance. The objective was total erasure. The erasure of the bloodline. Stalin didn't just want Trotsky dead. A bullet was too quick. Stalin wanted him broken. He wanted to strip away his family, his followers, and his sanity, piece by piece, until Trotsky begged for the end. The NKVD launched a psychological war of annihilation against Trotsky's children. His youngest daughter, Nina, died of tuberculosis in Russia after her husband was arrested and shot. His oldest daughter, Zinaida, was allowed to leave Russia to seek medical treatment in Berlin. But the moment she crossed the border, Stalin revoked her citizenship, cutting her off from her husband and child forever. Driven mad by the isolation and the relentless NKVD stalking, Zinaida turned on a gas stove in a German apartment and killed herself. "They are hunting us like animals," she wrote in her final note. Then came the sons. Sergei was a brilliant engineer who wanted nothing to do with politics. He refused to leave Russia, believing his innocence would protect him. He was wrong. The NKVD arrested him. They tortured him, demanding he confess to plotting against Stalin. Sergei refused. He was shot in the back of the head and thrown into a mass grave, murdered simply for carrying his father's DNA. The most devastating blow came in 1938. Lev Sedov, Trotsky's oldest son and his right-hand man in the resistance, was running the underground network in Paris. He checked into a clinic for a routine appendectomy. The clinic, it turned out, was heavily infiltrated by Soviet intelligence. Lev died in his hospital bed under highly suspicious, agonizing circumstances. Thousands of miles away in Mexico, Trotsky received the telegram. The brilliant orator, the man who had commanded armies and ordered the execution of the Tsar's family, finally broke. He locked himself in his study. For days, his wife Natalia heard him sobbing uncontrollably. Stalin had systematically slaughtered his entire family. The message from the Kremlin was written in the blood of his children. "There is nowhere to hide. You are next." Operation Duck, the frontal assault. By 1939, Stalin's patience ran out. He summoned Pavel Sudoplatov, the deputy chief of foreign intelligence for the NKVD. "Trotsky must be eliminated within the year," Stalin ordered, staring at Sudoplatov with dead, unblinking eyes. No matter the cost, no matter the country, Sudoplatov designed a two-pronged attack. The mission was codenamed Utke, Russian for duck. The first approach was brute force. In May 1940, the NKVD activated a sleeper cell in Mexico City. It was led by David Alfaro Siqueiros, a famous Mexican muralist and a hardened, fanatical Stalinist. In the dead of night on May 24th, Siqueiros and a hit squad of 20 heavily armed men descended on Trotsky's compound in Coyoacan. They wore stolen police uniforms. They overpowered the exterior guards. They didn't come to assassinate Trotsky. They came to obliterate him. They kicked open the door to the courtyard and unleashed a storm of lead. They carried Thompson submachine guns and automatic rifles. They fired over 300 rounds directly into Trotsky's bedroom. They threw incendiary bombs, setting the house on fire to force the occupants out into the crossfire. Inside the dark bedroom, Trotsky woke to the sound of shattering glass and splintering wood. His wife Natalia reacted with split-second instinct. She threw herself on top of him, pushing him off the bed and into a tight corner of the floor. The bullets ripped through the mattresses, pulverized the walls, and shattered the furniture. But miraculously, by sheer geometric luck, The angle of the gunfire missed the corner where they lay huddled in the dust. When the shooters retreated, leaving the house in smoking ruins, Trotsky stood up, untouched. In Moscow, Stalin read the report and exploded in fury. The frontal assault had been a spectacular failure. It hadn't killed his rival. It had turned Trotsky into an international martyr. The Mexican government sent the military to fortify the compound. The walls were raised. Steel doors were installed. Trotsky's home became a fortress. Stalin realized you couldn't kick the door down. You had to have someone open it from the inside. The Trojan horse Pseudoplatov pivoted to the second half of Operation Duck, the internal plot. This mission belonged to a single man, Ramon Mercader. Mercader was a Spanish communist, a veteran of the Spanish Civil War, and a highly trained NKVD operative. His mother, Caridad, was also a fanatical Soviet agent. Mercader was cold, disciplined, and entirely devoted to Stalin. Mercader didn't try to climb the walls of the fortress. He seduced his way through the front gate. 2 years earlier, under the orders of Soviet intelligence, Mercader had traveled to Paris and adopted a fake identity. Jacques Mornard, a wealthy, apolitical Belgian businessman. He sought out Sylvia Ageloff, a lonely American social worker who was a devoted Trotskyist. Mercader played the long con. He showered Ageloff with money, attention, and affection. He became the perfect boyfriend. When Ageloff moved to Mexico City to work for Trotsky, Mercader followed her. He changed his alias to Frank Jackson to cross the border. For months, he drove Ageloff to the compound. He never asked to go inside. He played the part of the bored, supportive boyfriend waiting in the car. Slowly, the guards got used to him. They saw his expensive suits and his easy smile. They lowered their guard. "He's harmless," the chief of security told Trotsky. "Just a rich kid in love." Eventually, Mercader was invited inside for tea. He became a fixture in the house. He offered to drive Trotsky's wife to the market. He brought chocolates. He never talked about politics, which made him a refreshing break for the paranoid, stressed-out exiles. He was the Trojan horse, and they had welcomed him into the living room. The strike by August 1940. The NKVD command in Moscow sent the signal. It was time. On August 20th, Mercader approached the compound alone. He told the guards he had written a short article on French economic statistics and wanted the old man to look at it. They let him in without a search. After all, he was family. Despite the blinding dry Mexican heat, Mercader was wearing a heavy raincoat. Inside the lining, he carried a 14-inch dagger, an automatic pistol, and a shortened mountaineering ice axe. Trotsky led him into the study. It was a chaotic room, overflowing with books, newspapers, and a dictaphone. Trotsky sat at his desk. Mercader stood behind him, positioned slightly to the left to avoid the light of the desk lamp. "I placed my raincoat on the table so that I could take out the ice axe," Mercader later confessed to the police. "I took it in my fist. I closed my eyes and I struck." But the strike didn't end the story. When Trotsky screamed and fought back, the perfect assassination turned into a bloody brawl. The guards burst in. They began to beat Mercader to death, smashing his face with their guns. "Kill me," Mercader screamed, blood pouring from his mouth. "They have my mother. They are holding her." He wasn't lying. The NKVD had his mother, Caridad, waiting in a getaway car just 2 blocks away. Leonid Itingon, a senior Soviet spy master, was behind the wheel. When they heard the sirens of the Mexican police, they didn't try to save him. They hit the gas and fled the country, leaving Mercader to his fate. Stalin's terror demanded absolute sacrifice. Trotsky was rushed to the hospital. He slipped into a coma and died 26 hours later. His brain had been pierced to a depth of nearly 3 inches. His final words to his secretary were, "I am confident of the victory of the Fourth International. Go forward." The hollow victory. In the halls of the Kremlin, Joseph Stalin celebrated. The hunt was over. The last witness, the last rival, the last true threat to his absolute ideological supremacy, was dead. He secretly awarded Ramon Mercader's mother the Order of Lenin. Mercader himself spent 20 brutal years in a Mexican prison. He was beaten and tortured, but the NKVD training held. He never broke. He never admitted his true identity, and he never admitted he was sent by Stalin. When he was finally released in 1960, he flew to Moscow, where the KGB secretly awarded him the Gold Star of the Hero of the Soviet Union. But Stalin's victory was a terrifying illusion. He had successfully driven an axe into the skull of a 60-year-old man, but he couldn't kill the ink on the page. Trotsky's writings, his blistering critiques of the revolution betrayed, survived. They became the foundational texts for generations of dissidents who sought to understand how a movement for human liberation had devolved into a meat grinder of totalitarian terror. The assassination of Leon Trotsky is the ultimate philosophical indictment of the dictatorship. Secure leader does not hunt an old man across the globe for 11 years. A confident system does not need to murder children and infiltrate bedrooms to survive. Stalin possessed the largest army in the world. He controlled a vast, nuclear-armed empire. Yet he was so profoundly terrified of a single intellectual with a printing press that he redirected the entire apparatus of Soviet intelligence just to silence him. Stalin swung the axe because he knew the fatal weakness of his own empire. You can build walls, you can forge steel, and you can rewrite the history books. But in a system built entirely on a foundation of lies, the truth is the most lethal weapon on the battlefield. Trotsky bled out in Mexico, but the stain he left behind revealed Stalin not as a god of the proletariat, but as a terrified, insecure monster hiding in the dark.